What if everything you thought you knew about Socrates was just the surface? Maybe, just like me, when you think about Socrates, you think about someone who's walking around barefoot or on sandals, and all he does is just think about questions and life questions. But before he became a philosopher, he was actually a warrior, a lover, a friend, and was much more than just a thinker. And that's what we're going to talk about today with Armand D'Angour. He wrote a book about Socrates called Socrates in Love. We'll talk about his bond with General Alcibiades, his time as an elite soldier, his role in elite circles, his childhood, his death sentence, and much more. Let's bring the man behind the philosophy to life. If you love history and you love reading, then listen to me. I made a list of 100 history books that will completely change your life and is completely free. You can download it, link is in the description. Now enjoy this new episode. So, why do we know so little about Socrates' early life?
The main reason is that the people who knew Socrates and who wrote about him were young men when Socrates was an old man. So the two main sources of our knowledge of Socrates' life are the philosopher Plato and the biographer Xenophon, both of whom knew Socrates when he was in his 60s because they were born around 425 BC. Socrates was born 469 BC. So if one assumes that around 410, both Plato and Xenophon were in their teens, they might have first met Socrates then, he would already have been 60. And both of them preserve a lot of information about Socrates' trial and his death and so on. But they do so from the perspective of knowing him as an older man, someone in his 60s who then died at the age of 70, having been indicted of various crimes and subjected to death by poison.
Hmm. Yeah, I think your book did also such a great job of um, focusing on an area which we mostly like don't even look at. So these younger years, like showing Socrates as a warrior, Socrates as in being in love, like all these different types of Socrates that we've never seen before. I mean, when I thought about Socrates, I thought about barefoot walking Socrates, and that's about it. So you did a really great job doing that. Was that very difficult, like source-wise, getting that information?
Thank you. No, I mean, in a way, the source material for the young Socrates is embedded in the texts of Plato and Xenophon, but there are also many other sources which we can become aware of from quotations in later writings, such as those of Diogenes Laertius, who wrote about the lives of philosophers, but he cited a lot of contemporary evidence for Socrates. And uh, it's less that it's not a question that we don't have sources for the younger Socrates, but that on the whole they've been overlooked and ignored because what was felt to be the most important aspect of Socrates' life was his philosophical quest that he pursued quite intensively in his later years. So Plato and Xenophon would have known of Socrates walking around Athens barefoot in threadbare rags. They wouldn't have known who the earlier Socrates was apart from what they heard from him or from others. So, for example, Plato gives a lot of information about Socrates' military activities in his younger life, given that he would have finished fighting by the age of 50, and Plato wouldn't have known him until about 10 years after that. But that information Plato puts in his symposium into the mouth of Alcibiades. Now, Plato would have known Alcibiades, who was a young statesman, general, playboy, politician, and he would have heard him speak, and he would have known something of Alcibiades' relationship with Socrates, which comes over quite clearly in the symposium. And one of those things was the relationship of Alcibiades to Socrates as a fighting man. Both of them fought in campaigns, which would have been, 15 years before Plato himself was ever born. And we get a report of that. I mean, how reliable, it's impossible to say, but it's very clearly laid out that Alcibiades and Socrates shared a tent, for example, at the Battle of Potidæa in that campaign in 432 to 429 BC. And that sort of evidence, I think, can be pulled together in order to teach us something about the earlier activities of Socrates when he wasn't simply a philosopher walking around Athens subjecting people to his examination techniques.
Yeah, I'd love to get like deeper into the relationship between Alcibiades and Socrates. As you wrote in your book, Socrates loved one person above all, the ever youthful, beautiful Alcibiades. Alcibiades, could you explain to me also what you meant by saying that Socrates saw him as kind of like an alter ego of himself?
So when I was trying to investigate what the younger Socrates would have been like, one of the things that struck me very strongly was that we had a lot of evidence for Socrates fighting in Athens battles. So in the Symposium of Plato, we learn that he fought in at least 3 campaigns, Potidæa in 432, Delium in 424, Amphipolis in 422, which would have been close to when Socrates was getting on to retiring from heavy infantry service. They call them hoplites, heavy armed infantry. And in a colleague wrote an article once in which he said Socrates fought all these battles not despite himself, but because he believed they were part of what it meant to be a good patriotic Athenian. I think that must be right. Socrates was not the kind of person who, if he thought one should be a pacifist and one shouldn't fight, wouldn't have restrained himself from doing so. I mean, he clearly fought because he believed it was the right thing to do. Or at least he joined Athens campaigns. So I was struck by this notion that Socrates must have started as Athenians did when they were quite young. They would have to avail themselves of a panoply, that's a suit of armor. Perhaps it is something that he even inherited from his father. And that in itself gave us a clue that Socrates was not of a very low class, because you had to have quite a high wealth qualification to qualify to fight as a hoplite soldier. You needed to maintain your armor, and that was an expensive business. So I realized that the younger Socrates was someone who was keen on doing the right thing by his city, which included fighting as a heavy armed infantryman. And it struck me that also this was something that comes across in the way he argues, an ambitious sense of wanting to succeed and to win over opponents. So a combination of that sort of, you might say, characteristic of Socrates, a character, and the fact that he was a devoted soldier, made me think that he was similar to what we learn about Alcibiades. Alcibiades being a young, patriotic, enthusiastic soldier himself, someone who was keen to fight, keen to gain glory in Athens battles. And I thought perhaps that this explained why Socrates was so fond of Alcibiades, who in many ways appears to be such a different person, someone who's devoted to success, to material worldly success, a soldier, a fighter, a politician, and yet someone who Socrates claims and is reported in Plato's dialogues to have said that he loved him more than any other man, and that they were the most um, uh, close of lovers. And so in my book, I suggest that Alcibiades was a kind of alter ego. He was someone who Socrates might have wanted to be himself, a successful, brave, dashing soldier when he was a younger man. Um, and that perhaps explains why he was uh, continuously indulgent towards Alcibiades, even though Alcibiades didn't follow the philosophical life that, in the end, Socrates seems to have thought was the most important thing you could do for your soul.
Hmm. Do you think this explains why he didn't take credit for saving Alcibiades and like because that was his moment, right, where
Mm.
something along those lines
A-
happened?
At the Battle of Potidea, Alcibiades appears to have impetuously run forward into the enemy lines, requiring Socrates to break the line himself and save the beloved young man. Socrates managed to do so. He lifted Alcibiades bodily from the fight and saved him and his armor. So it was a mark of honor that one doesn't abandon one's armor on the battlefield. And Alcibiades presumably had been knocked out, and he would have lain there and his armor would have stayed even if Socrates had managed to lift him out of the fray. But Alcibiades makes a point in the Symposium of saying, "You rescued not only me, but my armor as well." And that armor included a shield, which was said to have been embossed with an image of the god Eros, the god of love. So it was quite a fancy shield, and one that Socrates appears to have managed um, to rescue along with Alcibiades himself. Um, and Alcibiades says, "And you should therefore have been given the reward for valor which I was given." Because he says the commanders knew of my status. And that suggests that Alcibiades knew that he had been the one to create a problem that Socrates had solved by rescuing him. But because of his high status as an elite Athenian, he was the ward, for example, as a young man, he'd been the ward of Pericles, the leading citizen and leading general of Athens. And that status was, he says, what made the commanders think he was worthy of an award for valor and not Socrates. And so that's what he says. He says, "You know that's true, Socrates." He says that you shunned this thing when. So presumably people said, "Well, Socrates should be rewarded because he was the one who saved the man." And Alcibiades said, "Of course that's true, but they wouldn't hear of it because they wanted to give me the award." So that's a picture that we get in the Symposium. Socrates wasn't considered of sufficiently high status for the commanders to want to award him for what he had done, but Alcibiades notes that very clearly.
Okay, so it isn't for philosophical reasons that he declined like an award for it. It was just a political thing going on.
Yeah, it sounds as if that was the case. And Alcibiades says, you were even keener that I get the award than they were. I mean, so for whatever reason, Socrates felt that his actions didn't need to be recognized by this reward, and it was something that Alcibiades clearly would have coveted to be given an award for valor, for prowess in battle. So, I mean, you could say there might have been a philosophical attitude held by Socrates, which was, I did the right thing and I don't need to be rewarded for it. Um, and he didn't need that external recognition. He was happy for it to be given to the younger man.
That's a great lesson for all of us to learn, I think. And
It is.
Alcibiades, like, he's got quite a tragic end. Do we know anything about Socrates, his opinion or maybe some sort of remorse that he didn't guide the young man? Do we know anything about that?
No, we don't. So what we get in the symposium is simply that Alcibiades says, when I was with Socrates, I didn't stray off the path of virtue. But as soon as I was out of his presence, I did things which he wouldn't have approved of. So no doubt Socrates looked at his beloved friend with a certain indulgent despair. You're supposed to be pursuing the things that make your soul better, but really what you want is success and fame and sex and all the things that Alcibiades went for, even to the extent of betraying Athens for the Spartan enemy when the Athenians wanted to arrest Alcibiades for his sacrilegious behavior. He went over to the other side and he caused a lot of damage to his own side. So all of that was something that Socrates surely would not have approved of. And Plato and Xenophon are keen to make sure that people don't lay it at Socrates' door that he allowed Alcibiades to do things that were against the interests of the Athenian people.
Okay. Let's get a little more deeper into his military story, because I think that's probably one of the most fascinating parts of your book, because I never saw Socrates as a soldier. Um, while doing your research, what amazed you the most about Socrates as a soldier? Was it a certain story, certain battle?
Mm. Well, again, in Plato's Symposium, we are told of his bravery at the Battle of Potidaea, 432 to 29 BC. So a 3-year campaign up north in freezing cold weather. And Alcibiades in the Symposium tells us that Socrates would go barefoot in the ice as if it really didn't affect him, and other soldiers would look at him askance because they think he was showing off and showing them up because they would try to wrap themselves up against the cold, and he had this extraordinary fortitude, hardihood. And so we get that picture of Socrates. He says he could go without food uncomplainingly, go without food and drink. He was obviously extraordinarily strong and had managed to train himself physically so that he didn't suffer hunger and pain in the way that some of the other soldiers did. And that would have made him obviously a good fighter as well. So Alcibiades goes into some detail about how when there was the retreat at the Battle of Delium, which was in 424, the Athenians suffered a bad defeat at the hands of the Boeotians, and they ran from the fields, but Socrates walked steadily off the battlefield. And it's a great picture that Alcibiades paints of this man striding purposefully, he says, looking side to side, making sure that anybody who tried to attack him would get the worst of the fight. And so that's a picture of Socrates' ability to retreat from battle in a way that allowed him to stay alive. And given that we never hear of Socrates ever having killed someone, I wondered whether this strong retreating stance of his was something that allowed him to fight in these battles and to survive, but not to come away saying, I killed so many of my opponents. But we never get any of that. And, allowed him to show himself to be a brave and strong fighter, while perhaps not indulging in the kind of mass slaughter that a very good swordsman might have been inclined to do.
But maybe that confidence did come from knowing your ability of killing. That's also possible, because I can imagine if you've killed before, then it would be less scary to walk away on a regular speed, I guess.
Yes, who
Uh,
knows? He must have been a capable fighter. He would have known how to use his sword and his spear, but he also would have been able to use his shield to defend himself.
yeah. How do you think that military experience influences later thinking in life?
That's an interesting question. So, given that he had such military experience, why does that turn him into a philosopher? I mean, in what way is it understandable that someone who has fought bravely for maybe 30 years uh, should become, in his last 20 years, solely a philosopher, someone who's trying to get to the truth of things? And presumably that's something he was doing before that, so that he was fighting alongside his philosophical activities. Um, it's hard to say how that might have affected the way he thought. So, one thing is clear from Plato, and that is that Socrates had a view as to what courage was. And in the dialogue Laches, there's a long discussion of this idea. Is it about not being afraid, or is it about being afraid and still fighting, which is what Socrates would argue was the case? A courageous person is not someone who knows no fear, because then they wouldn't be courageous. It's about knowing the fear and fighting in any case. So there are some direct links with his military activity and his philosophizing in that dialogue, for example. I think there may be more indirect links, as I suggested, in his very combative argumentation. So he was clearly a very able and um, resilient arguer. This comes across. And although he didn't necessarily claim to know the answer, he would have pursued the question in a way that very often exhausted his interlocutors.
Was he a aggressive arguer in the sense that he just kept on asking, even when someone didn't want to answer anymore? What do you mean with
Yeah,
fierce?
there is a sense of that in some of the dialogues, that he really pisses off some of his interlocutors. So in the Meno, for example, he clearly angers his interlocutor Anytus, who presumably is the same Anytus that eventually became an accuser at Socrates' trial. Um, Again, we don't know whether Plato has made all that up, but the picture he paints of Socrates is one of a very annoying and persistent arguer, and someone who won't take a simple answer for granted, but will ensure that his interlocutor recognizes that what they've said is not satisfactory.
Hmm. Now let's get into the more loving part of Socrates, because he also
Yeah.
has that side. Why did you actually decide to name your book Socrates in Love?
Well, for a number of reasons, but initially I was writing a book called The Young Socrates, because I wanted to pull out aspects of his early life, such as his military activities and so on, that were underrepresented in the sources and in the writings about him. Um, but then I discovered, when I was trying to get to the bottom of some of that early life, and of course Plato's Dialogue Symposium is key to that, that nobody had really got to the bottom of who this character Diotima in the Symposium was. And I asked myself what Plato could have meant by giving Diotima the name, which means honored by Zeus, and what he could have meant in particular by having Socrates introduce this woman, supposedly fictional, with the words that she had been responsible for postponing the plague of Athens by 10 years. And all the commentaries I looked at had no satisfying answers to either question, amazingly. I mean, they told us that, of course, that Diotima means honored by Zeus, but they took that to mean that she must be somehow a prophetic, visionary woman. um, without reckoning that Zeus was the common nickname of Pericles, and that Pericles famously honored his wife Aspasia, and that there is a comic playwright, Aristophanes, in the course of or very centrally in the course of the symposium, who talks about Zeus. It would have raised, surely, in some people's minds, the fact that the comic poets often called Pericles Zeus, and that Diotima, honored by Zeus, surely would have then referred to his wife, uh, Pericles' wife, Aspasia. So that was, to me, a tremendous epiphany when I realized that the name that Plato chooses for this woman who he makes Socrates say, taught me the truth about love, which is an extraordinary claim for Socrates, because Socrates, on the whole, doesn't claim to know the truth. He only claims to be a seeker after the truth. But to claim to know the truth and to know it because he'd been taught it by a clever woman seems a very unusual thing for Socrates to say. Then the other side of the equation that I think makes it clear that Plato is trying to tell the reader that Diotima is modeled on Aspasia is this introduction of her as someone who postponed the plague at Athens by 10 years. Now, some people would say, well, 10 years is just one of these generic lengths of time, but I don't see why it could have been generic in this case. I mean, it seems quite specific to say that she postponed the plague by 10 years. And so when one does the maths, 430 to 29 was the Great Plague at Athens. If that was postponed by 10 years, the implication is that it should have fallen 10 years earlier, in 440 to 439, but that a clever woman had done something to try and postpone it. And so that, to me, became very clear, because I think any historian asking what happened in 440 to 439 BC in Athens knows immediately that this is the time when Pericles had set out to conquer the island of Samos, and it was a very brutal 10-month campaign, at the end of which he notoriously strung up the commanders of the opposing side, the Samian side, on crosses, and ordered that after 10 days their bodies be taken down and thrown out without burial. So that we are told by a later source, someone called Durus of Samos, who's reported by Plutarch. So a lot of these sources are reported by later sources. And I see no reason not to take that evidence as true. Pericles clearly committed a war crime on the island of Samos, and it was one that had strong resonances for the Athenians, because the idea of throwing bodies out without burying them would lead to divine retribution. That idea is explored in Sophocles' play Antigone, which is written about the same time. Some people think it was just before the campaign, others have argued it's just after. Sophocles himself, the playwright, was a general who fought with Pericles against the Samians, so he knew what had gone on there. I think the year after he returned from the campaign, he wrote his Antigone, in which the notion of an enemy body remaining unburied is something that is seen as anathema, something that would result in a plague, something that requires honorable burial. And so I think that is what Plato is pointing at when he says she postponed the plague. There should have been a plague after Pericles' misconduct at the end of that campaign. There wasn't. 10 years later there was, and Pericles died from it. And so it seemed clear that people thought it was the postponed punishment for his behavior on Samos. And when Socrates introduces this clever woman who managed to postpone it, there is no other woman in the frame who would have organized sacrifices. The one person who would have wanted to help Pericles absolve himself of that crime would have been his wife Aspasia, then probably his wife of already of 5 years standing.
Hmm. And what would the reasoning be that Plato wouldn't mention Aspasia, her name itself? Is that maybe because Socrates didn't mention it, or because he didn't want to mention it?
I think there are good reasons for him changing the name. So, as you say, I mean, why doesn't Plato say, well, this was Aspasia's doctrine? And he uses the name Aspasia in another dialogue, the Menexenus, in which he has Aspasia teaching Socrates how to give the funeral speech that she claims she had already taught Pericles to do. So people might say, well, why doesn't he say she also taught Socrates all he knew about love? I think there are several reasons why Plato couldn't do that, but possibly the main one is that the doctrine he puts into the mouth of Diotima, the woman honored by Zeus, probably begins with what Aspasia said about love, which is that love starts with physical attraction but moves on to a higher level. But it certainly ends with something that Aspasia did not say, and that is that love in the end is about a transcendent vision of the form of good. Now, that is something that Socrates couldn't have reported, nor could Aspasia have said, simply because this is very much Plato's own doctrine, perhaps formulated in the 380s, 20 years after Socrates had died, but certainly nothing that was contemporary with Socrates' earlier life. The symposium itself set in 416 BC, and him talking about this clever woman giving him a doctrine of love from an earlier period. Well, that doctrine could not have been what Plato wants to present love or eros is. And so it would have been an absurd thing to put it into the mouth of Aspasia. That was one reason. I think other reasons are that Aspasia was widely um, derided and reviled in her time by the comic playwrights, who would have been known to a large section of the Athenian populace. So Pericles was lampooned as being Zeus because he was the orator who thundered like the chief of the gods and dominated Athenian politics. And Aspasia was called his concubine or his wife Hera, and she was also called other names that suggested she was too powerful for her own good and a dangerous influence. And that's what would have stuck with a lot of people, that she was those things. She was also called a prostitute. She was accused of keeping a brothel and providing girls, highborn girls, for Pericles' gratification. All these things she was accused of doing by the comic playwrights. Some of that would have stuck. So for Plato then to say, well, Aspasia actually had a doctrine of love that starts with physical attraction and moves to something higher, well, that would have been highly inappropriate. I think even Plato would have felt that's not possible. So I think there are a number of reasons. As I say, I think the fact that he puts his own doctrine into the mouth of Diotima already rules out the possibility of her being called Aspasia. But I think that also the fact that Aspasia would have seemed a disreputable source of knowledge for Socrates is another one. And perhaps a third one is that any kind of suggestion that Socrates was taught by someone, let alone a woman of low repute by most standards, would have been something difficult for Plato to want to write, to want to say. So let's say he had simply claimed that Aspasia had taught Socrates certain things that come across in the doctrine that he gives to Diotima. One of those things would have been the search for a definition. What is love? Something that Diotima is keen on, getting to a definition, and she comes to the definition that it is giving birth in relation to beauty. The other would have been the notion that love begins with the love of particular bodies and moves on to a more general, abstract kind of love. So those things are both things which Socrates is known for. And of course, a lot of people say those Socratic qualities are foisted onto this fictional Diotima. I see it the other way around. I think that Aspasia did indeed, that is, Aspasia did indeed give Socrates a doctrine that involved coming to a definition and moving from the particular to the general. But if that was the case, and that she provided him with those methods, then those are the two things which Aristotle, Plato's pupil, tells us Socrates did. So what is Socrates' contribution to philosophy? It's that method of moving from the particular to the general and seeking definitions. Well, if he learned those from her, from a clever woman, then that was basically something that she should be credited for and not him. I think Plato would have found it very difficult to say, actually, Socratic philosophy must go back to this woman's teaching. Now, what did Socrates actually say? Who knows? But I think Plato would have heard him say something like, I learned all I know about love from this clever woman, and he would have named Aspasia. And hence, Plato is trying to do some justice to that by giving a name that some people would have recognized as relating to Aspasia.
Hmm. And besides love, did Aspasia have any other influence on Socrates?
All we know is that, well, we know from Plato's Menexenus that she taught him eloquence, or she tried to teach him eloquence. Socrates claims that when he tried to repeat some of the speech that she was teaching him and got it wrong, she virtually slapped him. So you can imagine this very close connection with this woman saying, no, that's not right, you silly man. So it is possible, isn't it, that she taught him something about speaking, if we are to take the Menexenus seriously, which a lot of scholars don't wish to, but, you have to pick and choose if you're going to say, we write off Plato in this instance, but we accept his evidence in that. So I would accept his evidence that she did teach Socrates and Pericles something about public speaking. So I think there's that influence. I think there's also an amazing historical matter, which only became clear to me after I've more or less written the book, and it only appears in the kind of epilogue that I give. And that is that Socrates famously avoided public political service all his life until 406 BC. And suddenly he appears as the chairman of the council which sets the agenda for the Athenian assembly, which makes laws and passes laws. Now, how did Socrates appear suddenly in his 60s to decide that he could do some public service, having avoided it all his life? And it happened to fall on a very important day, and that was after a battle of Arginusae, in which the Athenians, having won, had failed to pick up Athenian survivors because there was a storm, so many of the survivors drowned, and the Athenian demos, the people, turned on the commanders, and they insisted that they all be executed. One of those commanders was Aspasia's son Pericles, whom we know from Xenophon was someone who Socrates was on good terms with. And if I'm right in restoring some relationship between Socrates and Aspasia, Socrates must have known via Aspasia, perhaps after Pericles died, that she had this son, Pericles Jr., and was very keen that he, 20 years later or whatever, should not be executed en masse with the other generals. So what Socrates did as chairman of the council on that particular day is he tried to stop the mass execution on the grounds that it was illegal to execute people en masse, that they needed to be tried individually. So he tried what you might call a legal circumvention of the sentence. And it didn't work. And he actually says in one of the dialogues, and I made a fool of myself. So perhaps he felt that by trying to argue the case on legal grounds, he had failed. Now, the question is, why was he serving on that day in that position? And given that the Athenian system appointed such positions by a lot. How did he get himself? Did he manage to maneuver himself? And we know that there are cases of people maneuvering themselves into that position. But yes, he managed to maneuver himself into that position, presumably precisely in order to argue for having a separate trial for Aspasia's son Pericles. That, I think, has to be the answer. Otherwise, it's an extraordinary coincidence. And if things add up as I make them add up, which is that he was, in his earlier life, a lover of Aspasia, and that she would have known him and perhaps appealed to him in 406 BC when her son was about to be executed, I think that coincidence then becomes clear, because otherwise you ask yourself, how is it that he got himself into the position of being chairman of the council on that day when he was able to try his best to argue for Pericles Jr. not being executed? I feel that that's more than just coincidence.
Yeah, that's definitely more than just coincidence. And was it only for like one day? Like he only governed for one day? He was only in that
Yeah, it
position
was
for one day?
it's a 24-hour spell of office. So it was absolutely on that very day that it was decided that these men would be executed. And of course, the Athenian demos, we're told, the people regretted it shortly thereafter. They realized they'd been over hasty and unfair in executing the commanders.
And her son go executed afterwards?
He did get executed. He was one of the commanders who was executed for that dereliction on that particular day.
I see. Another important thing about Socrates that you wrote about in your book was his circle of elite, you could say. Could you tell me something about that? Like, what did that look like, and what are the figures and names
Mm.
that play the biggest role in his circle before
Right.
his turn to
So
philosopher?
very important to recognize that Socrates, as I say, being a hoplite soldier, had a high level of wealth, and that also we know he was associated with aristocrats, people of so-called high birth, in his own village. So he came from a village called Alopike, and his father, who was supposedly a stonemason, he was called a stone worker. That has generally been interpreted as someone of low artisan status, but it seems unlikely given that we're told that his father's closest friend from his village was a man called Lysimachus. And Lysimachus was a very aristocratic individual. He was the son of Aristides the Justus, he was called, one of the heroes of the Battle of Marathon, and someone who was of very high birth. And Lysimachus's daughter was called Myrto, and we're told by Aristotle, not by Plato, that that Socrates' first two children were born of Myrto. Now, if one thinks about it chronologically, if Lysimachus and Socrates' father were friends, as we're told, then Lysimachus's daughter and Socrates would have been roughly contemporary. So you can imagine that marrying a girl from your village, a girl of high status, was something that Socrates would have done perhaps in his 20s. And then he would have had, if Aristotle is to be believed, two sons from Myrto. So we get a different picture of from Aristotle, of Socrates' status, someone who is of sufficiently high status to marry the daughter of an aristocrat from his own village and have her two sons. By the time we get to Plato, when Socrates is 60, perhaps Myrto is already dead, we hear about his young wife Xanthippe. So people assume that Xanthippe is the only wife he ever had, and yet he could only have known her in his 60s. He had a baby with her, which he brought to the jailhouse when he was 70. So he can't have met her much earlier than 10 years before that, perhaps, if that. So this was someone who he married or had his relationship with at a much later stage of his life. And although Plato says they had 3 children, he just named all 3 children, I think Aristotle is clear that the first 2 were not by Xantippe. The third one was. In which case we can assume that Socrates had 2 grown-up children by the time he was executed in 399.
And in those aristocratic circles, what type of person was he? Like, was he more like a guest? Was he a critic? Was he a student? Like, did he learn from them? Like, what did that look like?
So, again, one piece of evidence which has generally been overlooked or dismissed is that when he was 17, we are told, Socrates visited the island of Samos with Archelaus. Now, Archelaus, or Archelaus, was a well-known philosopher of the day. He was within the circle of Pericles because his mentor or colleague was a man called Anaxagoras, who was perhaps the most celebrated philosopher of the day and someone who was a particular favorite of Pericles. So we have to imagine Pericles' circle in the 450s BC, consisting of these philosophers, which include Anaxagoras and Archelaus. And Archelaus picks up this young man and he takes him, age 17, to the island of Samos. And at the time, there was a philosopher on the island of Samos called Melissus, who was a very well-known philosopher. So I suspect Archelaus is introducing Socrates to Melissus of Samos at that period, which is in the 450s BC. But the other thing is that we're told in a very matter-of-fact way by Aristoxenus, a colleague of Aristotle, that Archelaus was Socrates' lover. And this again has been widely dismissed, but Aristoxenus is clear that Socrates was Archelaus's paidika. I mean, that word in Greek is unequivocal. It means they had sex. And that might seem shocking, but we have to remember that actually amongst elite circles in Athens in this period, there was a custom of what unfortunately is called paiderastia, love of younger boys. Some would argue that boys doesn't mean prepubescent, and I suspect that may be right. They talk about how a lover should not have a younger boy, but only one who has reached puberty and is already growing hair. But whatever the case, there was this custom of older men taking under their wing, for the purpose of education and socialization, younger men, if they were in elite circles. So it wasn't the case for everyone. It was clearly frowned on by the common people. And it was for these elites who needed to introduce young elite men into their society. And it didn't necessarily involve sex, but it perhaps would have done so in some cases. And in the case of Archelaus and Socrates, we are told unequivocally that it did. So, yes, I mean, what does it tell us? It tells us that Socrates was bisexual, maybe, but it also tells us that he was in an elite circle where this kind of thing was expected. So that's perhaps the most important thing that we get out of this testimony, that he and Archelaus were lovers, and that is that they were part of this higher elite circle surrounding Pericles, and that Socrates shouldn't be written off as someone who came from a very lowly background with a lowly artisan father.
Mm-hmm. Because you just mentioned like it's for educational reasons, it's for mentorship reasons, but not necessarily sexual reasons. That's sometimes an extra if both parties are interested, or is it only if one party is interested? Like, what does that even look like? Because would it
Yeah,
be, because you just mentioned like if Socrates and him did have sexual relationships, does that instantly mean he's bi, or does it just mean that one of them wanted it?
of course, we haven't got definitive answers to this, but it would seem fairly shocking if an older man imposed himself on a young boy, a 17-year-old, whatever Socrates was supposed to be at the time, if there was no mutuality. And this is something that comes across in Plato's Symposium. He has one of the speakers in the Symposium, which is, of course, a dialogue about the meaning of love. One of his speakers is Pausanias, who has a settled homosexual relationship with the host of the party, who's a younger man called Agathon. And Pausanias argues very insistently that there's a good type of love and a bad type of love. And the good type of love recognizes that what you're doing is caring for the soul of the younger person whom you love and not just gratifying yourself sexually with them. And that if that love leads to a steady and lasting and productive relationship, then it's good. If it's simply one in which an older man has sex with a younger one and then dashes off and has sex with another one, that is bad. So that distinction is clearly made in Plato. It clearly implies that there were many who did have sexual relations with younger boys, but were not committed or faithful in the way that Pausanias suggests you should be if you're going to have the right kind of love. So one might hope that in Socrates and Archelaus' case, it was a genuinely educational relationship, but it was one that also involves, apparently, if we are to believe Aristophanes, sexual relations between the two. When it comes to Socrates doing the same with his beloved Alcibiades, Plato wants us to know, whether again it's true or not, that the older Socrates loves the young man but does not have sexual relations with him. So that comes across in Alcibiades' speech in the Symposium, where he says they served together at the Battle of Potidaea, they slept in the same bed. Alcibiades decided he wanted to seduce Socrates because he loved him so much and thought he was such a marvelous man. But Socrates would hear none of it. He just lay by his side, he says, as if he was my father or older brother. So Plato wants us to know that Socrates was not interested in gratifying himself sexually, but wanted to have relations with a younger man for the sake of improving them, educating them.
Hmm. And with such a circle, such elites, aristocrats, powerful people, is there any signs in his biography where you see that he might be a little tempted to take that route, to follow their lead?
Sorry, whose lead?
The lead of the elites and aristocrats in like taking over that type of behavior.
Right. Yes, that's interesting. So, of course, he does in the course of his life attract a lot of followers, a lot of students. He does act as a mentor. He famously does so without taking money for it. As far as we can tell, other philosophers and so-called sophists did ply their wares, intellectual wares, in Athens for money. And Socrates was unusual in not doing so. He was prepared to have loads of mainly young men followers who would follow him and learn from him. So in that sense, he is doing something that was known to elites, but he was doing it in an unusual way. It may be that that is what underlies the accusation for which he was charged at his trial, that he literally destroyed or corrupted young men. And there is a sexual connotation to the word in Greek, diapherein, to corrupt. So if he corrupted young men, perhaps they were implying that he did so sexually as well as intellectually. That, I think, may well be the implication of that. No doubt completely unfair, or certainly Plato wants us to think it was entirely unfair. And Socrates argues in his apology that's his defense speech, that he was not corrupting them, he was teaching them how to think.
Okay, I see. And in reading your book, like I found one thing very interesting, and also because you related it to psychological, you could say, issues that we see these days. Because you wrote, one of the components of his decision to become a philosopher rather than concentrate on fighting on politics was was a sense that he was the beneficiary of a divine sign. Like he felt like
Mm.
he was some sort of like destined maybe to become a philosopher in a sense.
Yeah.
Well, like,
So,
any heard a voice or something like that?
yeah. So, I mean, he tells us, again, in the defense speech as reported by Plato, he tells us that from a young age he heard a voice in his head. And he said it told him what to avoid for his own safety. So we have to imagine this young boy already hearing voices. Now, we would say that's a psychological issue. And if we want to be rationalistic about it, where does hearing voices come from? There are all sorts of possible etiologies for voice hearing, not necessarily good ones. Um, but here he had this voice which he says warned him, for example, not to go into politics. Don't get into politics because people will dislike you for it. So that's his reason for saying he stayed away, because he heard this divine voice saying that. He calls it his divine voice because how do you account for something like that in ancient Athens? You don't say I'm mad or I have a psychological disorder. That sort of thing is 19th century onwards. You say I hear a voice. So yeah, of course, I wanted to ask myself what the origins of this voice might have been. And I related it to his parentage and the fact that he was clearly at odds with what um, his father might have wanted him to do. I mean, given that his father was probably quite a successful stonemason, given that he was in these elite circles and so on, perhaps Socrates, who did learn to carve, we're told, he did learn how to carve stone, but perhaps Socrates was supposed to carry on in that business. But from a young age, he's not interested. He's going off and looking for interesting people to listen to in Athens. And maybe that's something that caused friction between him and his father. Again, we don't know this. Socrates, in one dialogue, talks about how boys who play truant are beaten by their fathers. And I would make something of that to suggest that he knew that truancy led to that kind of beating because he was himself subject to it, perhaps. Perhaps we can put all this together and create an image of Socrates running off to listen to Parmenides and other philosophers in town that he speaks about, coming back to the family stonemason yard and his father giving him a right thrashing, saying, you've got to do what you're told. And that then leads to a sort of a split in his mind between what he should do according to his father and what he should do according to his calling. And maybe that's where this voice starts to come in. The voice that tells him what he should do, what his calling is, what he should listen to. Now, all of that is purely speculation, but I mean, the alternative is simply to say he heard a voice that he called his divine voice, and that he followed it by not going into politics and so on. I just wanted to ask myself if there were a possible organic reason, you might say, for him being subject to this voice. It was clearly important to him, and it would have set him apart from his fellows. So that, and a tendency to what we might call a kind of catatonic behavior, which is standing very still and thinking, or perhaps zoning out even, which we learn that he did on campaign in Potidaea, and the soldiers were so amused they brought their beds out. It was summertime and they wanted to watch to see when he snapped out of it. But that was also perhaps part of a psychological condition, because it's not a normal thing for a young man to do, to stand still for hours on end. But you can understand perhaps that it is psychological. It's not just, Plato, how does he describe it? He says he was thinking of some problem, or gets Alcibiades, you say, he was probably thinking, and he couldn't come to the solution. So he just stood there. It cannot be as simple as that. You can think of a problem tossing and turning in bed, not standing in a catatonic trance. So that trance-like behavior and him talking about his divine voice, all of that suggests to me that he had some psychological condition, unknown, undiagnosable, undiagnosed condition. But it led him to be a different kind of person from his peers, even if he wanted to be the same kind of person, even if he wanted to be a soldier in Athens' battles. He couldn't sustain that because he was different.
Hmm. Yeah, I can imagine like if you're such a thinker, it's very difficult to be in like a battlefield situation because you just want to spend your time thinking about problems instead of like fighting these wars.
It's possible that he did want to do that, or it's possible that his catatonia, his standing still, was a condition which he couldn't help, and that it didn't mean he was thinking at all during those periods, but that he was just he'd zoned out. It seems more likely to me that he wasn't actually meditating a problem, but that he was in a kind of trance-like condition.
Ah, that's interesting. Okay, because I always thought it was more like he was just looking at something and just focus on it for 12 hours and just not moving and just thinking, but he was just probably thinking about nothing, just zoning out completely.
I think that's more likely. I think that, Plato wanted to rationalize it by saying he was thinking of a problem. He gets Alcibiades to say that, and when he couldn't come to the solution, he just kept thinking, and he was still. But that seems to me an unlikely explanation for someone standing still in the middle of the street. You might have a problem that you think about. You like Archimedes, you might go to the baths and think about it, and then suddenly get the solution and shout "Eureka!" But you don't stand still in the middle of the street unless there's something wrong with you. And there's something wrong with Socrates.
Yeah, I believe so too. And like, do we know anything about that it happened like often with him like trying to find solutions or not? Or was it just like this one period during the military campaigns that he came to that
Mm.
trance?
So we're told of him standing still on more than one occasion and thinking. So famously at the beginning of the symposium, he's standing in the street thinking of something before he goes to Agathon's house to join the party. So we're told about that, and we're told about him standing still when he was on campaign. Um, I'm not sure there are other specific episodes which we're told about, but we hear that this is the kind of thing he did. So that's something about the condition that Socrates suffered, I think, and that people assumed it was the easiest thing to assume that he was really trying to solve a problem. There's no evidence that he, yeah, yeah, uh, they didn't have the sort of terms for madness and catatonia and so on that we now apply to such behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think because you just talked about it for a second, I think it's also very interesting to talk about the execution. Like, could you explain to me like what was the reasoning for it as we believe it to be right now?
So Socrates was brought to trial on three charges: corrupting young men, not believing in the city's gods, and introducing new kinds of gods. So, two of those at least were religious charges. One of them was perhaps quasi sexual, but veiled a political um, accusation, that is, corrupting young men. But the thing is that in 399 BC, when he was brought to trial by radical Democrats, i.e., those who supported the democratic assembly as a way of ruling the Athenian state, as opposed to some of the oligarchic coups that had meant that certain groups of wealthy and um, powerful men had for a while, in the course of the past 20 years, been the rulers of Athens. So those were the options. The radical Democrats brought Socrates to trial because they associated him with elite young men who had tried or who had been associated with trying to overthrow the democratic constitution on at least two occasions. So in 411 BC, 12 years before Socrates was brought to trial and executed, during the course of the Peloponnesian War, it hadn't been going well for the elites, and the elites decided that this was because the Democrats were in charge, i.e. Athenian democracy, where you had all the members of the citizen body voting on actions of war and peace and legislation. That was not something that aristocrats, the few thousand at the head of Athens' wealth and status ladder, could control. So what they did in 411 was stage a coup. Initially, there were 400 of these elites in charge of Athens, and they killed a lot of their democratic opponents, and then it became a broader-based oligarchy of 5,000, which some of the historians tell us was the best Athens had ever been governed during the period. But the radical Democrats, the people who wanted to turn up to the assembly and have their votes heard, overthrew that in 411. And similarly, when Athens lost the war to the Spartans in 404, the Spartans imposed an oligarchic group of 30 men who became known as the 30 tyrants. And they also committed a lot of atrocities. They killed and executed a lot of their democratic opponents. So the Democrats then reformed outside of Athens, and they came and fought a pitched battle and killed many of the 30 tyrants, and they reinstated the democracy. So Athens, having been through two political coups in the previous decade, came back to being a radical democracy. And one of the first laws that democracy passed was that it was not allowed to bring people to court, people to law, for having supported the aristocratic rule that had happened on a temporary basis in those 2 years. So there was what they called an amnesty. And, the thing is, if a society was to thrive, they couldn't just keep fighting the elites and the demos, the people. So very sensibly, a bit like the South African Truth and Reconciliation, the Athenians passed this law in 403 that said you weren't allowed to bring people to trial for political reasons. And so when 3 years later, there was a sense that people had got away with subverting the democracy and they were looking for a scapegoat, they found Socrates as an easy scapegoat because he was still plying his wares, he was still getting people to think and to talk and to debate how people should live and how they should be governed. And they charged him with 2 religious offences and one more nebulous offence of corrupting young men, because those would allow them to charge him without them saying, actually, it's illegal to charge someone for having been a supporter of the anti-democratic tendency. So it's clear, and it was clear to later authors such as the orator Aeschines, that Socrates was executed or brought to trial for political reasons, that the restored democracy wanted him to be a symbol of the aristocratic coups that had turned Athens around in previous. I mean, you must imagine that there would have been possibly thousands of people who knew of relatives who had been killed by these oligarchic regimes, and they wanted some kind of revenge. And so Socrates was the person to find they could avenge themselves on, not least because he was odd and he said things like he had a daimonion, which is, a divine sign. So one of the accusations which accuses him of introducing new kinds of deities, uses that very word, bringing in kaina daimonia, new kinds, newfangled daimonia, as if there was anything actually wrong with that. I mean, Athens had a very permissive polytheism. It did, in fact, bring in new gods during this period, and others. It brought in the god Asclepius, for example, the god of healing. It set up temples to him. It brought in gods like Bendis from the Far East. We're told at the beginning of Plato's Republic, I think quite deliberately, saying, you Athenians are always bringing in new gods. How could you accuse him? And the other accusation, a religious one, was not worshipping the gods of the city, or not believing in, not carrying out the customs of, the word in Greek, nomizdon, of the city's gods. Well, again, from what we learn from Plato, Socrates was fairly conventional in his religion. His very last words are, let's sacrifice a cock to the god Asclepius, a thank you offering. He's often talking about his devotion to Apollo, and he is not someone who comes across, certainly in Plato's dialogues, as derisive in any way of traditional religion. So, not believing in the city's gods, perhaps he wasn't visible as engaging in public sacrifices, in public activities that may have been of a religious nature. But it sounds like a very weak charge. And the thing is that he could have undoubtedly escaped the charges. He says to himself, there was an opportunity to pay a fine. He turned that down. He pissed off the jurors, perhaps deliberately, and said he was doing the right thing. And they voted by a larger margin that he be executed after having voted he was guilty of the charges. The crime was execution. And a very perceptive colleague, Mary Lefkowitz, has written that Socrates would have been aware that dying a noble death was the way to go. I mean, had he been let off and lived in obscurity, having paid a fine, or had his rich friends pay the fine, we'd probably never have heard of him. He doesn't appear in the pages of Thucydides, amazingly. The historian Thucydides, who writes about this whole period, does not mention Socrates. Now, maybe Plato and Xenophon, who were so devoted to him, would still have spent a lot of their writings about him, but I think it certainly spurred them to see that their beloved teacher had been executed. And of course, the first thing that both of them then write is a report of his defense speech, his apology. And then they go on, or Plato particularly goes on to talk about a lot of his other doctrines. So, who knows? Xenophon has him say, look, I'm an old man, I haven't got that long to live, and I'm not particularly well, so I might as well die a noble death, die a dramatic death, and one that will allow my teachings to outlive me. That certainly happened. So who knows? Maybe Socrates had the last laugh in that respect.
Yeah, I think ensuring your legacy, the best way is to get executed for sure, or dying that type of death. You mentioned that they had political reasons, but one of the things the judges said was that he was corrupting the youth, right? Like, was it besides political reasons also reasons that they were scared that Socrates was opening the minds of young men, was maybe giving them new ideas, new ways of living, luring them to think, those type of reasons, or was it just pure political?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because in a way, a lot of people have said precisely that somehow the Athenian state was afraid that Socrates was opening the minds of young men to ways of thinking that were somehow alarming. But that's not how it comes across. In the sense that if he was saying to them, here are all kinds of new intellectual pathways that you can take. Well, there were lots of teachers doing that. Teachers, for example, of the medical art, the so-called Hippocratic doctors, who were coming up with new ideas about how to treat illness, or people in the musical world. I mean, yes, the new music of the period was alarming to people like Plato. He thought that, this new wave of music was dangerous to the stability of the state. So, so Plato himself might have thought that Socrates was doing things by teaching new ideas, but clearly didn't think that, because he doesn't say that's what Socrates was doing. Socrates was questioning. That was what he was doing. He was asking people, how should you live? Question your assumptions. Now, that may be something that is hard for people to do, but it's not likely to be the kind of thing that gets them to say this person should be executed. Certainly not in a relatively pluralistic environment, such as you had in ancient Athens, where there were lots of new ideas coming, lots of books being written, lots of people coming up with important innovations. So I don't think that can be the reason. I think that the new ideas that the democratic accusers were afraid of was the idea that democracy itself was a bad thing, and that you needed educated elites to run a society properly. And that in the previous 15 years, that had shown itself to the terrible detriment of Athenian democracy, because these educated elites had actually asserted their power and killed a lot of their opponents. So that, I think, is what they felt he was doing by associating with these elite young men, and that he was corrupting their minds politically. I think that is really what they were thinking, rather than that he was simply getting them to think and getting them to head for the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he is quite conservative in some areas of thoughts, right? Like the gold wise, like he did actually believe in the Greek gods. It's so,
Yes.
yeah, what you say, like that sounds most reasonable, yeah. That the
Mm,
reasoning is the political area and the revenge, those reasons,
mm.
instead of like just corrupting youth.
I think that's right. I think part of the charge reminded Athenians that people like Socrates and people in that circle did attract younger men to mentor them, but also to have sex with them. And I think that was increasingly considered something that was wrong. I think the period of Athenian culture in which homosexual relations could flourish in Athens, I suspect, was gone by the beginning of the Peloponnesian War in the 430s. And the idea that that somehow might continue with Socrates and his circle was seen by the accusers as something that was unacceptable. And I think, that unacceptability is already evident in Plato's Symposium when he gets Pausanias to talk about the two different types of love, the good type and the bad type. Um, and one of the reasons for wanting to legislate for that, as Pausanias suggests states should do, is because the fathers of the young boys must have found it very disturbing when their youngsters went off with an older man, and they thought, well, they should be getting married and so on. So there would have been that strain in the Athenian demos that felt that this kind of elite activity, which involved possibly homosexual liaisons with younger men, was a bad thing. And I'm personally sure that that is what the accusers were drawing on when they used this term, corrupting the youth, corrupting young men.